jump right in because I think it's up. Good to be together, my friends. We'll get to our page and presentation and all the fun. There we go. Good old Mark. So last time we looked at the end of chapter 8, which was Jesus was getting frustrated with the Pharisees, so he left that part of the world, went back across the Sea of Galilee and up to Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus famously asked them, "Who am I?" or "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter, for once, gets it right. So that's literally where we ended last time. That's how the chapter 8 ends. Actually, it 9:1, the very first verse of the 9th chapter, is the ending of that particular story. So now we start at 9:2, which is the beginning of the next story. We have the Transfiguration. So I don't know about y'all, but for me, this is one of the hardest stories in all of Scripture to tell or engage or just know what's going on.
All right. So I will forward you this email.
I think that was Lynn talking. Anyway, so this is one of the hardest stories to tell or engage. I just don't honestly know what to do with it. But what we'll do, we'll look at, there's sort of two parts to the story, really. First is the actual transfiguration, and then there's the part where they come down the mountain and talk about it a little bit. So we'll look at each, and wow, we'll see where we can go with it, because it is a tough one to open up all the way, or even part of the way, probably. So 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. All right, so we could probably spend an entire class, if not an entire year, wrestling with the Transfiguration, what it means. And here's the one thing we can say definitively: no one is completely sure what happens and why. What I mean by that is this is one of those mysteries to a certain degree of the church. We will say, obviously, that this is Jesus revealing something about his more godly nature, but even then, which part's revealing which? What does it mean? It becomes really complex really quickly. So I'm going to share some broad ideas that people have as theories. That doesn't mean they're definitive. It just means those are some of the ideas. And then we can see how much we want to engage this or where we want to go. So first, the very first word, 6 days later, that's obviously a reference to creation. Creation took 6 days. So it's 6 days later, meaning that it's the Sabbath, or is it a new creation, right? So what is this, a continuing part of creation? Is it a Sabbath day? Either way, if it is the Sabbath, if it's the Lord's day, then we should expect to see God on that day, right? So that might be a reference that people make there. Peter, James, and John are portrayed as a sort of inner circle, which is interesting because there's nothing that prepares us for this moment, right? Like, it's just one that they are listed as separate and apart, and they become an inner circle, but only because they got to be there. That Jesus sort of goes, "Hey, you 3 come with me." So I guess they're an inner circle, but Mark doesn't have the same inner circle. Luke develops that more, where Peter, James, and John sort of disappear with Jesus on a couple of occasions to have some sort of top-level conversations, behind the scenes kind of things, but doesn't happen in Mark. Pretty much all the disciples are dumb. It's just that Peter, James, and John happen to be on this mountain with him. So that's sort of a question. Then the line itself, Jesus was transfigured. In Greek, the word is metamorphosis, which is interesting that we feel the need to translate that to transfigured. it means the same thing either way, but metamorphosis, I think, is a word that most people know better than transfigure. The most literal translation is Jesus was changed, or Jesus was transformed, or changed forms. And so I don't know if that helps at all, but it is interesting to see to think of the words themselves here that are being used. And really, the word is just as undefinitive as the moment itself. So, okay, he changed form, or he changed appearances, or was transformed into what? Right? So, William Placker links this moment to Paul's hymn in Philippians 2:6-7. That's the great Christological hymn of Philippians that starts out with Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave and being born in human likeness. And for some, that means, oh, well, this is Jesus revealing that Godhead that he began before creation with and still maintains in the incarnation, right? So John Chrysostom, who, by the way, that's the best. If you're going to get a good nickname in the world, John Chrysostom gets the best. It means golden-tongued. He was called the golden-tongued one because he could preach a heck of a sermon. He said, what does transfigured mean? It means that he opened out a little of the Godhead and showed them the indwelling deity. Well, but here's the thing. The scripture says that the deity cannot be seen without dying, right? So how does that work? These are the questions that people very quickly ask about the transfiguration. You know, in the Old Testament, if you can't see God, if just to see God means death, then what are these guys looking at? Irenaeus, wrestling with that, declares that Christ's flesh is like the cleft in the rock where Moses stood while he saw God. If you recall, God says, you can't see me, you'll die. So I'll put you between two rocks and I'll hold my hand over your face, and then you'll just sort of see me barely pass by, and that will be enough. So that's what Irenaeus claims. Then interestingly enough, this whole transfiguration conversation and moment becomes part of the iconoclasm debate in the 8th and 9th century. That is, in Constantinople, the Byzantine rulers believed that the Old Testament law that said there could be no graven images meant there could be no art or icons, and so they spent the good portion of about 100 years burning thousands of icons, tearing them off the walls, destroying statues, anything that had the image of a human, or certainly an attempted image of Jesus and God. All because there was this idea that, because of that Old Testament law that says there can be no graven images, then we should be doing the same. Interestingly, then, the transfiguration becomes part of that conversation where John Damascus writes at the time, in former times, God, who is without form or body, could never be depicted, but now, when God is seen in the flesh, conversing with men, I make an image after the God I see. Obviously, this is a little bit of a side conversation, but it's fascinating because all of Western art depended on the iconoclasts losing. Literally, if we could not paint people, think of how different all of Western art would be. If in the 8th and 9th century, the iconoclasts had won, then we would literally have paintings with no people in them. And certainly no images of Jesus or God. Which is basically the entire Renaissance then would have been a very, very different imagery kind of time. So that's a little bit of a side conversation, but it was all caught up in this transfiguration conversation. That is, well, we could sort of see God here, but can't see God here. Or we can see God, but only through Jesus. So is that holy too? All of these things became the big conversation, right? So here's the briefest description. The change doesn't really get a whole lot. Jesus's clothes begin to shine brightly, right? Okay. This has a previous reference, likely to Moses in Genesis 33, where his face shines anytime he sees God. If you don't remember that, Moses would go up the mountain, talk to God, and when he came back down, his face would be radiant, would shine brightly. And he had to literally wear a veil so that people could be around him because his face got too bright just reflecting God's glory in his face. Which is a sort of fascinating kind of description. And again, that was also a moment where you went up a mountain to see God in the same way that disciples go up the mountain with Jesus and see him transformed and Jesus glowing. All right. And this is another fascinating side, but since we're talking about art and everything else too, thanks to some absolutely terrible translations, the Hebrew word for shine was mistranslated in the Latin text in the Middle Ages, or in the Dark Ages, as horns or horned. And so Moses is depicted as one with horns as a result. This is one of those, if you look at a lot of the Renaissance paintings, you know it's Moses because he has horns, because they mistranslated the Hebrew word for his face was shining. And so they said his face was horned. And so this is Michelangelo's famous depiction of Moses. And yes, those are horns. Because somebody mistranslated the crazy things that happen in the world. And if you go back and look, there's lots. You can Google Moses with horns, and there are literally thousands of images that will come up on Google because of this mistranslation. A lot of illuminated texts and manuscripts and all kinds of things have Moses with horns. And yes, the stupidity of one person or group of people with that translation issue created the situation where Moses has horns, and then people who can't read or were illiterate saw Moses with horns and thought he was the devil, or thought therefore the Jews were the devil. And it led to a great deal of anti-Semitism. That's how our world works, unfortunately, right? Just one silly mistake that leads this cascade of problems that we're still unpacking today. Again, side curses. Sorry, I find these things fascinating. That was a total aside. Back to the matter at hand. Back to being on the mountain and the transfiguration. So how do the disciples know it is Moses and Elijah? This is me. This is a Bill Murray question. I want to know how these guys go up on a mountain, Jesus is with them, and then they go, oh, clearly these two people talking with Jesus are Moses and Elijah, right? Is Moses doomed to carry 2 tablets, and Elijah always has to show up in the chariot of fire? Like, how do they just know? Do they have name tags on or what? It's a fascinating thing to me. Like, okay, hey, yeah, there's 2 old bearded guys. I guess that's Moses and Elijah. We don't get any answers to that question either, but it's just a sort of this whole scene leaves so many more questions than answers for me, right? Because there's this question of how do they know it's Moses? How do they know it's Elijah? Jesus glows, he's radiant and transformed, but they can't even give words to what he's transformed into. And even then, what's the purpose of it, right? Why was he transfigured? Why was he had this metamorphosis so that the disciples, this inner group could see what's the point, right? What is he trying to do? So Peter can be stupid, but this is one of those moments where I think it's unfair to Peter. Super unfair. That is, all the Gospels say that Peter was afraid or did not know what to say, except for this is the only logical thing. You might even say this is the only fully logical thing Peter says. That is, he goes up on a mountain, Jesus is glowing, Moses and Elijah are talking with him, something extraordinary is happening, right? We can say that. We don't know what it is, but something extraordinary is happening. Peter is basically like, hey, why don't we stick around and talk about it? Let's figure out what's happening. I don't know what's happening up here, but this seems to be a pretty cool thing. Like, it's Moses and Elijah and Jesus are all talking. This seems important. Maybe we should set up some booths and be here, right? And it could be a reference to Sukkot. That's the festival of booths in the Jewish tradition. If you don't know that one, Sukkot, or the Festival of Booths, is a celebration of the receiving of Torah. So every fall, it depends on, they're on the lunar calendar, so it can be as early as September and as late as almost November. Jews are encouraged to set up a tent in their front yard, a booth in their front yard, that reminds them of when they were wandering in the wilderness and when they received Torah from Moses and God, right? Like that God spoke to Moses, he wrote down the Pentateuch, the Torah, and gave it to Israel. And this is a reminder. You're supposed to spend a week in your booth, eating and celebrating the harvest festival, and that God gave us the teaching of Torah. So that's what Sukkot is. Now, most Jews will set up a booth in their yard, but they don't necessarily spend the night in it. Some will, more hardcore folks. A lot of times they just sort of have a dinner and have a nice sort of meal under an arbor, give or take, but not always spending the whole night and the next day and sort of full on camping outside. Most go inside and sleep in their bed. But that said, if this is Peter's reference, again, I get it. This one, out of all the stuff that happens here, I understand Peter the best of what's happening, right? If he's referencing Sukkot, if he is engaging all of this stuff and he sees, again, Moses and Elijah and Jesus in these transfigured, transformed, metamorphosed states, that he's like, hey, I don't know what's happening, but we need to write it down. We need to share it. This is sure seems to be a God moment, a sacred moment, a holy moment. Maybe I need to receive the new Torah. Maybe this is the new gospel, the new word, and the new news, right? So again, Mark sort of downplays it and says he didn't know what to say because he was terrified. But I'm going to give Peter the benefit of the doubt here, because this is one of those moments where you go, Peter might be onto something, for wanting to have this conversation. All right, so that just gives you the first broadest thing. And I had a couple little side notes there. Sorry, I had to do it. What do you hear? What do you see? What else do we want to talk about with the moment itself? With what does it mean? How do we engage it? Any of those kinds of things.
I have always been struck by the story, and you just gave me a new way to think about it, okay? But
Sure.
the old 6 days later, that's always, boy, that was awful specific.
Yes.
And nowhere else do I see that in the gospel, 6 days later or 7, whatever it is, okay? So I found that very interesting, not realizing we're talking about creation. But how I look at it, this is like all the stories. This is a follow-up to the last story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's answering the question that Mark is really asking us throughout his gospel: who is this man? Okay, and so first of all, there's the story of Jesus asking the disciples, and then you have this, the transfiguration or the metamorphosis or whatever we want to call
Whatever
it.
we got, yeah.
Whatever we got was just as a follow-on to that, making you try to answer, who is this man? And of course, Mark's thought is this is the Messiah. This is the Son of God. Okay, even though Jesus, and throughout Mark, he's referred as the Son of Man. But at any rate, there you go. Interesting story. I think you can put a whole lot more here than maybe was meant. Okay, because it is. Right. It's just I have no idea how you really explain it. You're right. How do they know it's Elijah? How do they know it's Moses? Okay, and then Peter certainly is not stupid. I mean, excuse me, if that had happened to me, I would be afraid. Okay, so yeah. I don't know that I could say a word. Okay, I mean, I'd just be just shocked.
Yeah.
And my biggest question in that whole story is, why were there just 3 of the disciples with him? Why there were just 3 of them? Okay, right. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But okay, I mean, I can ask questions for the rest of the hour and next week and the week after, whatever it is. Okay, this just leaves me with a lot of questions. And how I deal with it is just simply, this is just one more time answering the question: who is this man? Jesus.
Sure.
The spin you gave on it about the sukkot and the receiving of booths and the receiving of Torah, that I hadn't ever heard that explained to me before, so I'm sort of sitting with this newly, but it makes sense that that there would be some receiving of Torah in Jesus transfiguring
Mm-hmm.
Moses and Elijah being there.
Right.
I mean, that I can kind of get with that.
I'm not sure I understand that. Okay, the Festival of Booths is celebrating receiving of the laws, the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the transfiguration is the disciples understanding that Jesus is the Messiah. It's clear to them. I mean, is that what you're saying, Bill?
Oh, I'm just
not
saying,
sure.
I don't think Peter knew what was going on, but he said, well, Moses is here, Elijah is here, then we should be ready to receive whatever they're teaching. Right? I don't think Peter knows exactly that Jesus is suddenly God or anything else. I think they're just sort of awestruck, terrified, unsure. So Peter goes to something that he knows, which is, oh, well, if Moses is here, and the last time Moses was here, he was giving us the law, the Torah, then maybe we're getting a new Torah from these teachers, right? These are the wisest men of Israel. Maybe they're going to give us some new word or some new Torah, new commandments. I think that's how I would portray that, because I don't think Peter knew any better then than we know now, which is just what does it mean? Maybe I'm going to receive something. Maybe it's good just to be on the mountain and hang out for a while with these fabulous people and talk to them.
Yeah, and maybe Peter wasn't making that connection at the time, but maybe that's a connection, a connection for us to make now.
Right.
But what about the cloud that comes down, and then when it goes away, there's only Jesus, so Moses and Elijah are gone?
Right. Yeah. What about it? They just sort of disappear. Who knows?
And what about it, Betty?
I don't know.
You got it figured out?
Nope. Mm-mm.
Yeah. I mean, that's so much of this is just a wow. Okay. What do we do with this?
And if that's our reaction, can you imagine the reaction of the disciples who were there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're going, well, what the heck do you think they were doing?
Right. Well, and I mean, I can say there are lessons that we can take from almost any other story in Scripture, because you go, okay, well, Easter is about new life. We can understand viscerally, like someone was dead and now they're alive. Not that we see it, but we can just sort of understand that idea of new life and new birth. We can understand the trial and the crucifixion. We can understand death. I mean, like you sort of go through all these other parts of Jesus's life. This is one where you're just sort of like, I don't have, I mean, I've had mountaintop moments. Maybe that's what it's about, right? Ecstatic moments where you just experience the nearness of God. That could be it. But it's just a harder thing to describe and engage than some of the other themes about birth or life or death or healing even, or all the other stuff. You can sort of go, well, I can hook on this, but this one is one, okay. What was that? What is that?
And I don't know if this connection is appropriate or not, but it seems that the use of the word metamorphosis means that this was not some little change. This was a big deal.
Oh, I think that's a fair thing. Yes, this was a big change. He was completely changed, not a little changed. Yes. I think that's correct.
Like it goes way beyond his clothes being dazzling white.
Right.
But what was he changed to?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
What was he changed to?
So the transfiguration and the state he was in, I mean, it sort of makes me think about the life to come in glory. And I was thinking about what Stephen said about the only three apostles with him at the time. Is that sort of, are those the same three that were with him in the Garden of Gethsemane? Or I'm trying to see if there's something that relates there to show those connective, like, the passion, the start of the passion, and then now the transfiguration, like the glory coming.
I would honestly have to look it up, Marcy.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I don't know. I mean, I know, again, Luke has several moments where Peter, James, and John sort of disappear with Jesus and they do some stuff.
Right.
I would literally have to look through the rest of the Gospel of Mark and go, okay, is this the only time those three hang out with Jesus in private, or are there multiple times? Because it hasn't happened before now. It's almost always been either the entirety of anyone following Jesus or the disciples sort of as a group of 12 with Jesus, but not just the trio. Yeah. I don't know.
Do you think maybe another purpose of this story, Bill, is Elijah and Moses are there, and up to this point in time, they were probably the, for lack of a better word, the greatest figures, okay, in Judaism, okay?
Yes.
And now here's this, okay, while they're there, he's the one whose clothes become bleached, Jesus, okay? And then God comes like he does after the baptism, okay, John's baptism, he comes and says, again, this is my son, okay?
Right.
So I think this is actually a story that's trying to place, how do I want to say this, place Jesus above, okay, anything that's proceeded, okay, or preceded this event.
Well, Stephan, as you said that, it made me think maybe they're passing the torch. Here's the next. He is, Jesus is the most important prophet, person, representative of God now. Could that be it? They're passing the torch?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think it could be passing the torch. It could be pointing Moses and Elijah pointing to someone greater in the same way that, John the Baptist points to, one who comes after me greater than me kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's all of that's part of it in subtext and engaged. So we'll look here at the second half, the cloud, right? So Mark again declares that Peter doesn't know what he's saying. Maybe Peter didn't even know. Peter has a tendency to talk before he thinks. So it could just be that too, right? But a cloud overshadows them, and they hear God with the same thing again that Jesus heard at the baptism. They all heard the baptism. This is my son, the beloved, in whom I'm well pleased, right? God says the exact same thing. And in the last situation, in baptism, he begins his ministry. This time, Jesus turns to Jerusalem. So the rest of the gospel from now on, Jesus is pretty much moving directly towards Jerusalem and towards that final conflict and showdown and crucifixion, right? So there's also been sort of, because of the way it falls, that this is a point where Jesus is almost having a conversation about what he has to do next, right? Maybe a pep talk, or maybe here's a revelation to say, well, you just asked me who I am. I'll show you who I am. And now we're going to go prove that it's the suffering servant that God has in mind here, not the triumphant conqueror. The Gospel of Luke makes it even clearer. Moses, Jesus, and Elijah talk about his exodus, his departure. Luke actually lists what they talk about to make sure that we catch that even more. Mark doesn't. It's not in Mark, but like I said, Luke adds just that one little line that Elijah and Moses talked with him about his exodus, about his departure. Usually gets translated departure, but exodus I think is more powerful because Moses knows something about that, right? But yeah, I've also just thought this is where I have to laugh. If you're paying attention to your scripture, if that's what's going on, if Moses and Elijah are talking to Jesus about what's coming, what comes next, the crucifixion, death, and resurrection. And I was Jesus, I'd be really annoyed that I'm talking to the two guys that don't taste death. Because Elijah gets taken up in the whirlwind and the chariot of fire to heaven. He does not die. He literally just carried away in the chariot of Israel. And Moses walks with the Lord and then is laid to rest, kind of thing, which it's not clear if he dies or if God just sort of walks with him and he sort of walks out of existence almost, kind of thing. Either way, it's certainly not the brutal death Jesus is about to experience. I think Jesus would probably be like, I need to talk to some of the other prophets, please, the ones who actually got killed for this, not the guys that got the free side door exit.
I thought you were gonna say maybe I need to talk with Dad.
Yeah, that too, yeah. Wait, God, could you pull this one out? Dad, could you help me out on this one? I'd rather not get nailed to a tree. Yep. So who knows? Who knows? So continuing that, we don't get that clarity here. The moment is the same. Suddenly it's just Jesus and the guys again, almost like nothing happened. They just sort of look around and like, wait, where'd everybody go? We have this insane moment. We even hear God's voice. All of this has changed everything, but then sort of nothing's changed, right? Then it's just the four of them on top of a mountain going like, so what happens now? What are we supposed to do with the whole thing, right? Which, again, that's the seminal question for me for the Transfiguration. Maybe we don't have to do anything with it. Maybe this is just a theophany, that is a revelation of who God is, or a little bit of who Jesus is as God. And that's all we need. And that's the whole point, is this is just that brief moment as we begin to walk with the road with Jesus towards his death, a reminder that while it seems like everyone else is going to kill him, that God is manifestly in charge, that this is a choice to be the suffering servant, not a Jesus as this, I don't know, entity who's being beaten and drug around without any control or agency. In fact, it's just the opposite. We can think that he's the pure victim, and he is a pure victim in that he has no blame in it, but at the same time, it's a deliberate choice, right? That he still has that authority and choice to do. It's a lot, right? It gets deep quick. So we'll continue then with, now the disciples are going to come down the mountain. They got to start processing, what does this mean, a little bit. So as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Then they asked him, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he said to them, Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things. How then is it written about the Son of Man that he is to go through many sufferings and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written about him. All right. So now we shift back to the messianic secret, right? Now, don't tell anybody, don't talk about it till later, move on. Okay. Of course, they don't really know what he's talking about again. Like, I can't really tell you. I'm not going to tell anybody else about this because I'm not sure what I saw in the first place on one level. And on another level, they're confused because even though he's told them will die and rise again, they're sort of wondering what this means 3 days later. What are you talking about? We understand on this side of Easter, but if you were just a friend, it would make probably literally no sense. Wait until after I am risen. Risen from what? What are you talking about? When you wake up in the morning, what are you doing? All these things just point to the same thing, which is it is utterly confusing to Peter, James, and John. I think on some level, as much as it can be to us 2,000 years later, going, what exactly are we talking about here? All right, so we have to be clear, though, in this one. I do want to make this clear because this is one of those things I think people, in their earnestness and rush to faith and to confess Jesus as an exceptional person and teacher and as God. We have to be clear on this moment that despite the transfiguration, nothing else about Jesus is extraordinary in the text. What I mean by that is he does not glow or float or demonstrate powers unless he chooses, right? Said differently, Jesus likely appeared like an average human at pretty much all times. For no other reason than this, no source ever talks about his appearance otherwise. If he had a third eye, we would have heard about him having a third eye, right? I mean, if he glowed everywhere he walked, someone would have said, and he was always had this special glow around him, right? Because no one mentioned those things. None of the Gospels mention those things. None of his contemporaries or even vague contemporaries. Even when Peter is preaching about who Jesus was, it's what Jesus did, not what he looked like, right? He probably just looked like an average Jewish male in the Middle East in the first century. And yes, brown skin, Arabic features, broadly kind of speaking, right? Not probably like any of us, it's white Northern European folk. He's a regular guy, or again, they would have probably noted it. And it's just important every now and then to remind people of this, because he probably would not have been crucified or treated the way he was if he really did glow or walk 3 feet above the ground or those kinds of things. People probably would have been a little too scared to get too close to somebody doing all that kind of stuff, right? But if you just walk up and you look like everybody else, but somebody says you're special, that's a very different thing. I can't remember which one it is. I think it's Jose Saramongo's book, The Gospel According to Jesus Christ. I don't highly recommend this book, but it's fascinating. He was one of these guys that it helped me in this conversation, right? He declares Jesus is fat and bald. And what do you do with a fat, bald Messiah? And he points out that in Luke 7:34, the people talking to Jesus say that he's a drunkard and a glutton. And so he makes it literal in his book in that same kind of way that we're talking about all this kind of stuff. We have this image of Jesus and with long hair, thin to the point of sort of an asceticism kind of look, wisdom teacher, all these kinds of things. But it's just sort of a tradition that we've inherited of what Jesus looked like. No real description. He could have been fat and bald. He could have been tall and thin. He could have been 1,000 different looks, right? But we don't have that literal explanation of who he looked like or what he is. So we have to guess. So as we talk about images and how he was metamorphosed, transformed into this glowing revelation of God, we also have to talk a little bit about, well, what did he maybe look like as just an average Joe on the street, right? A little bit of a side note, but who knows? Maybe it's the best way to say it's just Jesus looked average. They did a thing a little while back. I think it was called The Face of Jesus. I think it was National Geographic did one of those that said what was someone who looked the first century, and they used lots of art and images to come up with an image of what Jesus may well have looked like, which in Roman culture, and that is what Jesus grew up in, right? In the midst of Rome, men did not have long hair. That was not acceptable. Most men wore a Caesar cut, wore their hair very short, and most were clean shaven, which runs counter to everything that we have as an image of Jesus. But that is absolutely what the men of Rome tended to wear. That was what was in fashion, right? There's conversation Jesus might have had a beard because that was a trait for Jewish men, that they would often have a little longer curls or a beard. Maybe he had those, but it's just interesting to sort of think about. So we talk about how Jesus was transformed. Maybe what did he also look like?
And we have that image in the Powell book for the New Testament.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Yeah. So who knows?
It's interesting that this guy would take one verse and decide what Jesus looks like based on one verse out of Luke.
Yeah. Well, it's what you get when you're an author, right? Just sort of spin like
that. But again, Bill, he says that, but nowhere does anybody else say that. Okay. Yeah. And so which again
Oh,
goes
sure.
back to which goes back to say, in all probability, he was just average Joe. Because if he was a drunken and a glutton, fat and bald, I think somewhere it would be mentioned, and it doesn't. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
even if it was just by the people who didn't like Jesus, would probably mention it, right?
exactly. It would have been mentioned somewhere or somehow. So.
Yeah. No, he's
Oh.
probably just an average Joe, is most likely.
Well, the actual phrase is at verse 34, 7:34, is the
Mhm.
Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Nevertheless, wisdom is vindicated by all their children.
Right. Yeah.
It's a stretch.
It's a stretch. It is a stretch. And it's clearly what Jesus is acknowledging is that's the critique of the people around. And also saying that's not really how it works, buddy. I'm not a drunkard and a glutton would be the implied response there, right? But and again, that's sort of a side note. It's just a name that this is part of it. So they do, then we have this sort of interesting conclusion with Elijah. They just saw him on the mountain, right? But Jesus basically goes, yes, Elijah will come. You just saw him, remember 5 minutes ago, you just met the dude, but Jesus makes clear that Elijah has already come. And we can say that most likely this is a reference to John the Baptist, right? He was rejected because that's the reference Jesus makes, that Elijah has already come, and yeah, they've treated him like they've treated all the other prophets. They rejected him, they killed him, they sent him away, kind of thing. It's just an interesting kind of conversation, but it's almost a non sequitur to a certain degree that the disciples are asking and engaging this whole thing. Like, what are you talking about with Elijah now? Like, this is, you can tell, if nothing else, the disciples are rattled, a little out of sorts for what the heck does any of this mean? We thought Elijah was going to come and set everything right, and then you would fix it all, Jesus. And he's basically going, well, Elijah did come. He did the best he could. Now I'm coming. I'll do the best I can, which is not at all, obviously, what first century Jews thought the Messiah would do. For that matter, it's not what we think the return of the Messiah will be, right? We can be critical of those first century Jews a lot of times for saying, oh, they just wanted the Messiah to fix everything. Well, so do we. We hope the same thing, right? With this whole idea of the second coming is, and Jesus will fix all this stuff because it's a mess. It's no different. It's the exact same expectation that we put on that arrival of Jesus, return of Jesus. So what do we make of this story? I think I just am concluding with a whole bunch of questions here because there's lots we can ask. So what are we supposed to do with it is one question, right? Which as a preacher, that's what I'm always stuck with when I end up on preaching on those Sundays. Is it an important story, right? We've decided in the church that it's an important story, but how does it rank for you and your faith? Is this one that matters to you? And on another level, what does it all mean? All that becomes part of it, right? What do we think? That's really the end of that kind of conversation. The next story is literally the rest of chapter 9. So I didn't think we could give full time to the Transfiguration and a 40-verse story after it. So we'll do the old layup thing here. But what do we think? About the Transfiguration broadly, specifically?
Broadly, I think it means something big is coming.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fair.
That was a big event. I think it's a foreshadowing of something much bigger is coming.
How about that?
As to an impact on my faith, I guess honestly, as I think about it, none, because I never think about this unless the story is brought up like today or if I read it. Okay, it's just not
Right.
It's just not important to my belief system and my faith. It just isn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I would agree. I don't know if it, for me, if it would, the story did not exist, I don't know if it would change anything I believe about Jesus at all, quite frankly. I don't know that it's completely unimportant, but it just doesn't have that impact. It doesn't speak to me the way many of the other stories speak to me, quite frankly.
Exactly. Yeah.
There are too many whys. Why is this happening? And why is Moses and Elijah there? Why do you have a cloud? And why is Jesus white or shining? And why, just why?
Yes, just why? Just why? Clacker noted that there's another famous notation that there was a famous anniversary for the Transfiguration. Does anybody know what that is? August 7th is the Feast of the Transfiguration. It's when they bombed Hiroshima. The advent of the atomic age is the Transfiguration.
Gotcha.
Which obviously is not biblical, but it does have the same idea of everything changed. That honestly makes more sense on some level than the story itself. I can go, I understand that transformation, right?
Wow. Was that planned? Do you know if that was planned, or it's just one of those unfortunate coincidences?
I have a feeling that was probably an unfortunate coincidence. I can't imagine a person of faith saying, you know, Jesus revealed himself as God, so we will drop a giant bomb on that day. I don't think would be the plan, but I don't know. I don't know enough about that history. I doubt it. I think it's probably just the day that the sky was clear and they could make sure there was a way to do it, but I don't know. Well, on that uplifting note, happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, yeah. How do you respond to that? Yeah. I'm Peter now. I'm speechless.
Yeah. Lord help us. Anything else we want to engage with all of it? So next week we will be off. We'll obviously next week's Thanksgiving. Hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. And then the following week, was it December 3rd? December 2nd, we'll come back then as our next conversation.
Okay.
I think we're good. Anybody have anything else before we conclude?
Well, I too would like to wish everyone a very happy Thanksgiving.
Yep. Thank you.
Yes, me as well.
Happy Thanksgiving.
And a happy Advent too.
And a happy Advent. It's coming.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah.
Right around
Hard to believe. Hard to believe. Well, take care, my friends. We will see you all very soon.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Greg, everybody. Marcy, Betty, Sheldon. Okay.